So we are recording now. Let me verify that Logan can actually hear and see us. Logan, you are muted. Okay.
Yep, I can hear you. I just can't, I don't have a camera, but I can hear everything fine.
Very good. Thank you, Logan.
Yep, thank you.
Logan, Julia, Logan, Julia, back to you.
Hey, Logan. Awesome. So yeah, just gonna move into discussing what climate resilience is, various terms that you might come across, and what people are doing to plan for climate mitigation and adaptation. Actually, before I started my master's degree 3 years ago, I probably never heard the words climate and resilience used together. You obviously hear about climate change and sustainability, but like what actually is this term of climate resilience? Great question. One that I'm continuously trying to figure out the best way to describe to the people that I work with. If you search for it on Google, you'll get a few different definitions, but generally speaking, the term resilience is the ability to maintain or recover from changing conditions. So in the section I pulled out on the right from the reading, it uses resilience in the context of conservation ecology, and is defined as the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to and recover from a disturbance. I think taking it a bit further, a better definition is the ability of a community, a natural system, or the economy to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to adapt to changing conditions, and also withstand, respond to, and recover from disruptions specifically due to natural hazards and climate change. So all that to say, climate resilience is about having the ability to bounce forward rather than backward after a setback like major flooding or wildfires. So occasionally you might hear the phrase bouncing back after a challenge, but if you think about it, why would we actually want to go back to what we had if that failed during the challenge? If a major road completely floods during a storm, should we simply rebuild it as it was the first time, or should we actually rebuild it better, elevate it, install better culverts or roadside infiltration to hopefully ensure it doesn't completely flood during the next storm? So that last part is what I consider the resilience piece. So there are a bunch of words on the screen, but there are some other terms you will likely come across that are important to define and distinguish. So the first one is sustainability. I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with it. It means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, particularly ensuring a balance between the economic growth, environmental care, and social well-being. This term is really focused on what we can do to make sure that we actually have a planet to live on in the future. And much like the term resilience, sustainability, to my understanding, was really the buzzword being thrown about in the last 15 years or so. So as we confront greenhouse gas emissions and a warming climate, that was really that term that a lot of people went to. So similarly, the term climate mitigation refers to the actions that reduce the levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere or enhance systems that absorb more greenhouse gases than are emitted. So essentially, focusing on keeping climate change from getting worse, because that word mitigate means to make less severe or serious. And in the space that I work, the term hazard mitigation is often more common, as this refers to actions that actually lessen the severity or intensity of a hazard when it strikes. And it also involves sustained actions to reduce or eliminate the long-term risks to human life and property. So hazards are things like flooding, extreme heat, drought, tornadoes, earthquakes, all of the above, and can also include man-made hazards as well. Like I can't remember what the examples are for that, but it can also include those man-made hazards. So climate adaptation refers to adjusting natural and built systems to accommodate and withstand actual or expected climate impacts. So generally actions that seek to moderate or avoid harm from climate change. So you can adapt or make changes to any condition that might affect you, compared to mitigating, where you try to reduce or lessen the impact of a hazard. And then the last term, probably that's the most common in my work, is this term vulnerability. So this is the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of a hazard. It can be calculated as the exposure plus sensitivity minus the adaptive capacity. And I'll go a bit deeper into vulnerability when I talk about the projects that I work on. So that was a lot. There is one bonus term that I wanted to define and discuss as I was pulling this presentation together. Just because I actually learned about it pretty early on in my master's program, and it really stuck with me because it's often used incorrectly. I'm sure y'all have heard it too, but it's called natural disasters. The Red Cross defines a disaster as a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or a society and causes human, material, and economic or environmental losses that exceed the community's or society's ability to cope using its own resources. However, a hazard like a hurricane or a wildfire only becomes a disaster once it affects a society or a community. So kind of like if a tree falls down in the forest, does it actually make a noise? A hurricane or a wildfire is a naturally occurring event, regardless of whether or not people or things are on Earth. So by using the term natural, it kind of takes away from the social and political environmental context of the disaster and the risks that they bring. So a better, likely more accurate term would be to just refer to things as extreme weather events or simply just a disaster, if that's what it is. So I challenge y'all to listen out for how news outlets describe like crazy flooding or huge hurricanes that impact communities. Are they using the term natural in front of disaster, or are they talking about it in a slightly different way? Okay, so we've got a little bit of baseline on some important terms. So let's move to talk about the report that I believe y'all might have read through. It's the Planning for Climate Mitigation and Adaptation report. The American Planning Association, or APA, is the professional program for planners like myself, and the Planning Advisory Service publishes reports that offer guidance on important planning issues and innovative practices that span a whole bunch of different topics. I personally haven't seen all of the ones that have come out. There's like 600 or something like that. But I thought this one did a really great job to lay some groundwork for people that are just kind of like getting into this space. So like any good journal article or report, the executive summary really does what it's supposed to and summarizes the major takeaways. So you really didn't have to read the whole thing. If you read the executive summary, you're doing great. The purpose of this report specifically is to provide other planners, ones that might not work in this area day to day, with the important tools and information for communities to be able to tackle and respond to climate change. So unless you live under a rock or you refuse to believe it for whatever reason, we all know that there's a climate emergency. Humans are causing the planet to warm way too quickly, and we're incredibly close to a point of no return. Sad, but probably true. But there are a wide range of actions that we can take, particularly related to how we develop and build or rebuild our communities. And the key is we'll need to engage all of the options. So climate mitigation, adaptation, and ultimately we can make our communities even more climate resilient than they are today. So at this point, I believe everyone's familiar with how the Earth is warming and most of the effects of climate change. So notably, increasing temperatures and extreme heat are one that's at the top of everybody's mind. I believe we recorded the hottest month on record this past July, which is kind of wild. I've also noticed that winter months down here in North Carolina are much warmer. I feel like the past 5 Christmases or so, it's been like 60 degrees on Christmas Day, and then we have very few days that are like below 40. So that's just like something that I've realized. So I believe that it's definitely happening. The oceans are also warming and causing sea levels to rise. The Arctic sea ice is decreasing. There's ocean acidification. We're also experiencing more frequent and intense storm events, which is kind of like the space that I work in. And that's kind of particularly relevant to my line of work. We're getting a higher number of thunderstorms, and those storms are producing more rainfall each time. So that's the example of like the frequency and intensity. The intensity of hurricanes is also projected to increase, meaning more damaging winds, higher storm surges, higher rainfall events. Inland flooding just from like creeks and rivers and heavy rainfall is going to become more frequent. So you see examples like the flooding that's happening in New York City, the flooding that happened in Vermont. Those are likely to become more common. And then also conversely, droughts and fire activity will also increase as a hotter and drier climate takes hold. All that to say, that sounds like there's nothing that we can do. We're all just in for like a rough rest of our lives. That's a little bit true, but there are things that we can do. We just have to take the actions to do them. So one area that some folks are working in more or less is trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can reduce emissions, so the global temperatures don't rise more than the 2 degrees Celsius before the end of 2100, we might stave off the worst effects, but that's currently a huge undertaking when emissions come from almost everything in our daily lives. The transportation sector, we know, generates the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, primarily from cars, trucks, and planes. But some mitigation actions for the transportation sector are probably the ones that are most talked about day to day. Options like shifting to a cleaner fuel and using electric vehicles. But planners like myself, we can make a big difference in this sector, specifically planning and implementing things like public transportation, building walkable communities that reduce the need to travel by car, and encouraging developers to use green infrastructure and pervious pavement. The energy industry and electricity production generate the second largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And this also includes fuel use in buildings, the manufacturing and construction industries, and also power plants. So some options to mitigate emissions in the energy sector are obviously increasing renewable power like solar and wind, increasing the efficiency of fossil fuel fired power plants, and then increasing the energy efficiency of buildings through things like water reclamation and passive lighting. And then the manufacturing, food processing, mining, and construction industries contribute about 24% of emissions, but those often rely on carbon capture and storage to mitigate the emissions, as many of those processes can't actually implement low emission alternatives. So an option there could be to increase the circular economy and the reduce, reuse, recycle. But the fast rate at which this industry moves makes it a little bit more challenging to find solutions within that sector. So it's beneficial to think about that whole life cycle approach in relation to sustainable development. So bottom line is, if the sectors don't begin changing their approaches now, emissions are just going to continue to rise. So how will these sectors actually be impacted by climate change? And how will the impacts interact with other social, economic, and environmental stressors? This is where most of my work lies, and you've probably seen before, the energy sector can be disrupted by extreme weather events. Temperature changes can impact the reliability for communities. For example, that extreme cold spell that Texas experienced back in 2021, it knocked out power and heat. And then conversely, the extreme heat temperatures contributed to California's rolling blackouts during the summer of 2020. So that's kind of those like big examples of how like that energy sector can be affected. Hurricanes and other storms can also destroy, like physically destroy the energy infrastructure and leave folks without powers for, days to weeks. So some adaptation strategies like community microgrids, efficiency programs, and backup generators are great options that planners can help communities set up so that when the grid is impacted, the results aren't as devastating. People aren't without power for, weeks on end. The transportation infrastructure is also essential in almost all cases. So when storms cause extreme flooding on the roads, cut communities off from emergency response or critical services, bridges can also crumble, pavement can buckle from high surface temperatures. All of these impact communities. Cities can build to a higher standard. Culverts can have larger diameters that will allow more water to pass through, or they can increase bridge clearances to accommodate those water levels, or even better, elevate roads that are near the coastline. Planners are particularly important when land use policies and practices are considered. So in those rapidly growing areas, are municipalities allowing developers to just pave over everything? Are subdivisions being built next to or within the floodplain? Are houses allowed to be built right next to the ocean? So when thinking about adaptation strategies, one of the most basic strategies is to clearly define and limit what can be built where. So the same goes for buildings and housing. If you rent or buy a house, make sure you take a look at the floodplain and where your place is in relation to it. There are so many adaptation approaches outlined here and in other project case studies that can be used as examples for communities to consider. It's not like we have to recreate the wheel every time in every community. But like I mentioned earlier, the important component is the action taken to implement these solutions. It's great to just list them in a project portfolio, but that won't actually get anyone anywhere unless they get funded and given the green light and are supported by the community. So North Carolina has made some good strides over the past few years in trying to understand who and what are at risk as the climate is changing. I'm going to go through just a few examples of the projects that I've worked on since I began with Kleinfelder, and then I'll talk about what types of things you might actually work on if you find a job in this space. So you may remember, although it can be really hard to keep track of all of them, but North Carolina was hit with two devastating hurricanes relatively recently. The first was Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and then Hurricane Florence in 2018. Matthew was the most powerful storm of the 2016 Atlantic hurricane season, and it contributed to about 25 deaths in North Carolina. I remember it because I was actually studying abroad in quotes at the coast of North Carolina, and we had to like evacuate from the coast inland. So we had to like go back, and then we still got like extreme rainfall in the center of the state, but it took us like a full week to be able to go back to the coast because all the rivers were flooding the roads. So that was like definitely stands out in my mind. There was historic rainfall measured across much of the eastern part of the state, and I think the highest recorded was like 19 inches. And like I said, many of the rivers reached like record levels with flooding that occurred like well beyond like floodplains and flood maps and things like that. So it was pretty wild. But ironically, the records that were set by Matthew in 2016, some of them were broken yet again by Florence just 2 years later. There are like over 30 inches of rain measured in a few parts of eastern North Carolina. 9 separate river gauges reported floods exceeding like the 1 in 500 year events. So it was just even worse. 42 fatalities and like damages over like $16 billion. It was just wild. And again, this was just 2 years after Matthew, so some folks hadn't even started to like rebuild. So partly in response to these extreme storm events, along with the overall pressure to just enact mitigation of emissions, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 80, which was North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and transition to a clean energy economy. Amongst the directives to state cabinets and agencies to address the clean energy transition, the order also directed the integration of climate adaptation and resiliency planning into policies, programs, and operations. This included the Department of Environmental Quality preparing a climate risk assessment and resiliency plan for North Carolina, and also led to the establishment of the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, or INCOR is how I'll refer to it. And INCOR was charged with supporting these new planning efforts and aiding the state in facilitating rebuilding following the hurricanes. So with the establishment of INCOR and the published Climate Risk Assessment and Resiliency Plan, state was off to a good start. 2 programs were soon after established. One was the Resilient Coastal Communities Program, and the other was Regions Innovating for Strong Economies and Environments. RCCP is specific to the 20 coastal counties in the state, which are all the ones that are designated as CAMA counties, and they touch coastal waters. The Division of Coastal Management runs this program, and the aims are to address the need to make more resilient communities through technical and financial assistance by helping communities overcome barriers in coastal resilience and adaptation planning, by boosting local government capacity, and supporting an equitable approach to climate resilience planning. So Kleinfelder was selected in the first round of this program to provide that technical support to North Topsail Beach, Surf City, and Topsail Beach. These are 3 separate municipalities, all located on one barrier island in southeastern North Carolina. That whole island is within that red box right there. And I think the island's like 25 or 26 miles long. So we were unique in that we were working with 3 separate communities, but all basically on the same island. Other consultants worked with like specific towns or specific counties. So the general process of RCCP is to develop a community action team of local folks that can provide insight into what goes on in each community, and give us an idea of like what their priorities are as far as like fixing things and addressing problems. Then we work with that team to identify what infrastructure and who within the community is at risk of hazards like sea level rise, coastal erosion, and flooding. Then we'll identify a portfolio of projects that can help reduce risk and better prepare communities ahead of the next major hurricane, whatever that looks like. So following the completion of all of these steps, that was known as phases 1 and phase 2. Once all of that is complete, that's like a report. That's basically all that it is. Then a 3rd phase opens up with funding available for communities to apply to, specifically for taking one of those projects and designing and engineering what it actually looks like. For example, our Topsail Island communities wanted some roadside stormwater infiltration along a beach road that consistently floods. So then once that design has been completed, a 4th phase of funding is available for actual shovel in the ground implementation and construction of a project. So our team completed phase 1 and 2 for Topsail Island, and now we actually just started the same phase 1 and 2 process for 2 new communities in North Carolina. Those are Burgaw and Holly Ridge. Ironically, Holly Ridge is like just on the sound side inland of Topsail Island, and then Burgaw is like a 30-minute drive, so they're like pretty close together. What will be interesting about the process for these 2 communities is that they are inland and they don't physically touch the coast, as you can see from this image of Burgaw on the slide. Each town also has their priorities for what they want addressed. One is interested in like reducing stormwater flooding on roads. One wants to connect a lower income community to grocery stores and jobs via a greenway that also acts as like a piece of green infrastructure. So we've got some like different things working there. So we're just now getting into the process with these two new communities. And honestly, this is the project that I'm most excited to work on right now. When I started with Kleinfelder back in February of last year, it was sort of like towards the end of the Topsail Island project, and they needed me to jump on and help there. So this is kind of like where my passions lie with like this project. So I'm excited. And then this is another image. This is what Holly Ridge looks like. So you can see they have like this one like random, I think this is actually one of their like more like high income areas that's over here, but this is the sound. And then down here off the right, like the bottom right corner, this would be like where Topsail Island is. So pretty close there. So I mentioned before, there were two programs established from that Executive Order 80. The second one is Regions Innovating for Strong Economies and Environments. It's a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it RISE. This program is administered by that INCORE organization that I mentioned, which was created to run the resiliency planning programs. So the RISE and the RCCP programs are essentially sister programs in that they are structured very similarly, but they differ a bit in geography and funding sources. The RISE program was managed through Regional Councils of Governments, also known as COGS, and it covered all of the eastern portion of the state. So on the map there, basically from KJN all the way over to the coast. Those were the COGS that were a part of this program right now. And this was due in part because these counties received disaster declarations under Hurricane Florence. So there was money specifically allocated to address some of the challenges like from that hurricane. So Kleinfelder specifically provided technical assistance to 3 regions, the Kartar, Upper Coastal Plain, and Lumber River, each of which had 5 counties and many different individual municipalities within them. And they also span different physical geographies. So the Kartar is mostly Piedmont, that region K, which is like right north of like the Raleigh-Durham area. The Upper Coastal Plain is what its name details and has a mix of lowland and Piedmont characteristics. And then the Lumber River region is kind of a mixture of all 3. They have some like sand hills, some coastal plain, and some Piedmont down in there. So all of these also have pretty rural characteristics with agricultural and manufacturing industries, and all of them were majorly impacted by both hurricanes pretty badly. So like the RCCP program, RISE was almost identical in the project structure, so what we actually did. Each region developed a local stakeholder partnership made up of local and county officials. We had some nonprofit, some planners, some emergency managers, things to that nature. Our team worked pretty closely with that partnership to understand and map critical infrastructure in neighborhood communities. We listened to the challenges that they faced following the hurricanes and other natural weather events, like the need to upgrade stormwater infrastructure or to install more stream gauges to give better data on river flooding, or to figure out ways to farm more environmentally sensitive. So we then created a project portfolio that detailed the most desired projects and aligned funding sources and grants that each project might be applicable for so that they could get funded and then implemented in the future. So in both the RCCP and RISE programs, we used a variety of climate-related data sources and mapping tools. One important tool is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which combines census data and, as you can see in the colorful chart, it determines the social vulnerability of each census tract. So this data helps emergency response planners, public health officials, and other planners to identify and map communities that will most likely need even more support before, during, and after a hazardous event. So the SVI ranks each tract on 16 social factors, which are listed on the screen there. And they include poverty, lack of vehicle access, crowded housing, mobile homes, things to that nature. So you can see an example of how those are actually mapped on the right-hand side for Fulton County, Georgia, I think is the example. And then each tract receives a separate ranking for each of the 4 themes, as well as an overall ranking. So for our projects, we specifically used SVI data as a criteria to determine where specific projects should be considered. If there was a highly vulnerable census tract, that means that they needed a little extra more, or they were going to be like adversely impacted by the next hazard. So that was kind of like how we focused our areas. So if you're interested in looking at that data further, if you just look up CDC SVI, you can play around with their interactive map, and they have it for the whole country. So happy to send that link around if that's helpful. The NOAA sea level rise viewer is also an important tool for our coastal communities. So this shows a simulation of water level rise, basically from like present day levels all the way up to like 10 feet, I think is how far it goes. So through these images, you can see the lighter blue areas that become covered with water as the sea level rises. We found this tool to be particularly useful in discussions with communities because they can visually see how the changes will begin to impact specific sites. It's hard to like conceptually wrap your head around like what does like 2 feet of sea level rise mean. But if we can show them these maps and say like at 2 feet, like all of this is going to be flooded. At 3 feet, all of this is going to be flooded. That can really like have some light bulb moments for folks. So that's a pretty useful tool, and it has like a couple of different sliders on there if you want to go and play around with that as well. And then one last hazard data tool that we've included in our risk and vulnerability analyses are wildfire risks, because most folks in North Carolina don't really consider this as much of a hazard as like flooding or hurricanes. But actually there are areas of risk, particularly where wildfires could impact homes. So the wildland urban interface, or WUI, reflects housing density and where people live in the WUI in rural areas, helps define the potential wildfire impacts to people and homes. The purple areas on the bottom left corner are like the more densely populated areas, and then the white and gray areas don't really have many houses there. Under the WUI risk index, that top left box, that ranges from least negative impact in yellow to the most negative impact in red. And then the wildfire ignition density is basically the likelihood of a wildfire igniting in an area based on historical ignition rate data. So the areas in green are like very low ignition, to the red area is very high. So if you see that like very concentrated red area for the wildfire ignition density, that's like one of the regions that we're currently working in right now. So that's something that like we should probably let the people know is a risk or a potential risk moving forward. So those are just a few data tools. I know y'all are a geography class and might be interested in that. They're pretty cool. I enjoy like learning new things as I like scroll through them. So once we have an understanding of the risks of natural hazards and the vulnerability of critical infrastructure in communities, how can we actually come up with solutions and move resilience forward? It sort of starts with funding appropriations from the federal and state legislatures. in North Carolina, the councils of governments received appropriations for providing technical assistance with local and regional disaster recovery, mitigation, and resiliency efforts. So this was outlined in like our state budget. The Lumber River Council of Governments, which was one of the ones that we worked with in the RISE program, took two of the projects we identified in their project portfolio. They put out a request for proposals to do the work and then selected Kleinfelder to complete those separate projects. One of them is a wetland restoration for flood mitigation project. And then the other one is what we call resilient routes. And that's flood resilient roadway accessibility for secondary roads. So one's focused on wetlands, one's focused on roads. The wetland restoration project we're currently working on now will ultimately provide an inventory and priority list of specific locations throughout the 5-county region that could benefit from restoration activities that specifically reduce flooding. We've worked to gather a variety of data layers and are working in ArcGIS Pro to intersect them and then assign them a score based on criteria with regards to which ones are best suited to restore. At the end of the project, the COG will then have a list of sites that can be used to support grant applications for funding the actual restoration activities in the future. And the Resilient Routes project is similar in structure, but we are conducting an inventory of secondary roads throughout the 5 counties to identify regionally significant roadways that are vulnerable to flooding. So this was a huge issue in Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. These pictures on the screen show I-40 looks like a river. That is not a river, that is a major highway. It was completely underwater for days, and local routes, like just within communities, were also completely flooded and cut off access for people to just move around. So this project, we're not looking at the interstate roads, we're really just looking at those secondary roads so that we can come up with solutions to make sure the floods don't impact communities in the future. So that was a lot. Happy to go back through and answer any questions, but I just wanted to leave you guys off with a few things that I think about when I talk with other folks. Like I mentioned earlier, I graduated with my undergrad degree in environmental studies, and I thought I wanted to get into the private sector. I'd done a couple of like state internships and things like that, but I knew that like the private sector was like kind of where the money was. But when I searched for like environmental consulting as a job in like Indeed or whatever, I got a lot of random positions that I didn't actually like seem to be interested in. I was getting suggestions for like jobs related to permitting or like field work sampling, and none of that really seemed to like click for me. I applied to a handful of them, but I didn't really get any responses. I pretty much got ghosted, and I was like, okay, that's fine. But after graduating, I took that temporary position with the UNC Institute for the Environment and kept on looking. The one thing I did use pretty frequently was LinkedIn. I understand that there's like maybe not as many people nowadays like that are currently in college or younger that are using LinkedIn. And I've heard like some of the reasons that people don't particularly enjoy it is because it can become a bit of a place where people brag about themselves and their accomplishments, which is definitely annoying to just see all the time, especially when you're looking for a job. But I've learned that it takes a little bit of like curating your profile and connections before you start to see the things that you actually want to see. When I was in my master's program, I had a semester-long internship with the World Wildlife Fund. It was a virtual internship, and then I had just finished it and made a post about LinkedIn talking about something that I had worked on. And someone that I had randomly connected with who seemed to be working in like the climate resilience space that I thought was interesting, he sent me a message and wanted to know if I was interested in talking with their company. So no surprises here, but that was actually Kleinfelder asking if I wanted a job working on their projects in North Carolina. So all that time that I had spent applying to like random jobs and getting nowhere, I had one connection and a few messages, and then I had landed a full-time paid job. So all that to say, I just encourage folks to use the tools that you have to the best of your ability. And then also while you're in school, take advantage of any conferences that you can. These are great opportunities to see what professionals are working on, meet new connections, and you can learn on top of things as well. So anything that you're able to go to, definitely recommend going to it. And then when you're thinking about what interests you, consider thinking a bit outside the box as far as the companies that you're looking at. My company brands itself as an engineering company, and I have literally no experience in engineering, or really anything related to what most of my company works on. But I was able to find a place that does cool work that I enjoy, and that was almost just by happenstance. So just consider, don't just look for like the environmental consulting position. Think a little bit further beyond that. So I covered a lot this afternoon. I hope it hasn't been too all over the place, but I really appreciate the opportunity to lend some insight into this really cool field that's super interdisciplinary, and it's one that I feel like you could probably make a difference in. Hopefully y'all feel the same way. I don't know. But please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email if you have questions about anything, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have now.
Cool. Cool. All right. But Julia, thank you for that. That was, again, that was a lot of information, but I think you gave us a lot to chew on. And what's nice is a lot of the things that you were talking about, we're kind of tapping into some of the questions I saw these guys put together.
Cool.
So given the time that we have, I'd like to get to those. So come on up here. So if you stand right here, the camera will look at you.
Okay, perfect. All right, sweet. Hello, Julia. Can you hear me?
There you are.
Yeah. How's it going?
Good. So you already touched on the NOAA sea level rise viewer, and thanks for sending that to us. And for me, it was very interesting because I go to Outer Banks a lot, and after a foot or two, you can already start to see like some major differences. And something that caught my attention was a lot of the flooding happens on the sound side more so than on the shore side. So I was wondering if there were anything in terms of hazard mitigation implications of like saltwater creeping up on the sounds, what that'll mean for like local economies and what they'll be doing to mitigate that.
Good question. Yeah, what you point out is something that I feel like the folks that live around that area don't actually think about as much. Everybody's focused on like the houses falling into the ocean. But with the hurricanes, you also see like storm surge, particularly in the sound as well. So what will be interesting, one of the communities we're working with does touch the sound side a little bit. So we'll have to think about ways that we can present opportunities for hazard mitigation that way. Some things that they're considering are options like living shorelines and things to that nature. But with like the water intrusion, I think they'll have to take a look at what is located on like the inland portion of that shoreline that touches the sound, and just think about like probably not building there, and like what is located around that area that could be adversely impacted, because that's definitely the area that folks are not thinking about as much as like the coast. So
yeah, and I forgot, some houses do get lost. Some houses do get lost, which you see, and it's kind of scary. But like the sound side is like the biggest source of food, and there's a lot of different, I guess, environmental things that are happening there in terms of habitats. So that's definitely a big deal for that as well. So thank you.
And I'll just say with relation to the habitat and the food, one other thing that we looked at with topsail specifically was water quality in that sound. So the sound that's between Topsail and Holly Ridge, Part of it is like an outstanding like water resource area specifically for oysters, I believe. So one thing that we identified early on was what is like the runoff from like upland doing to that water quality in the sound. I wasn't a part of like those discussions early on, but I know it was definitely mentioned and like nobody really picked up on it. They were more focused on, you know, the flooding of the beach road and things to that nature. But that's a good point that people should definitely consider.
Well, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, great question. Thanks so much.
Joshua, that sounds like a perfect GIS-3 project.
Yeah.
Let's see, who's up? Madyson, you up now? All right. Come on up. Abby, I think you're on deck. Okay. All right, so yeah, you're good. So there's your face.
Hi,
Hey.
I'm Max. Okay, so my question for you is that recently in class, we read a paper that described the author's attempts to remap all of the US metro regions, not based on the usual census definitions, but instead on novel commuter data that revealed strong commuting ties. So when we see public transportation being offered as a way to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, pardon me, how should we expect that to work in small micropolitan regions or other regions that contain rural commuter sheds? Would public transportation even be an effective alternative in areas like that?
Good question. I should bring in my colleague that works in transportation planning. But one thing that we looked at with our RISE program, so that was the regional like 5-county region. We were looking at the transportation sector as far as like what hazards might impact that. But almost all of them had no public transportation, like no bus lines, no anything. I think Lumber River was like, we have a point-to-point car that you can call if you need to like get to a doctor's appointment or something. So we realized like North Carolina is not like Boston, which is where my transportation colleague is. We don't have that infrastructure down here, and chances are for those rural communities, we probably won't. But one thing that we realized that was going on in our upper coastal plain region was they had kind of like a micro transit thing that they had implemented, and it was more or less a car that you could call that would take you anywhere within like the town limits. So something that I might consider is like if you don't have the public transportation, but you're relying on cars to get you from point to point, that your car is an EV or something to that nature. And then also recognizing that a lot of the folks that live in these rural regions, they are going to rely on a car. And so if there is infrastructure in place to support them with, you know, EV purchases or other like micro mobility options, that's probably the best that we're going to get. Yeah. If you have further questions about transportation, I'd be happy to connect you with my colleague in Boston.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But I think that was a pretty good segue, because I think our next question is a transportation question.
I regret to say that I did not take any transportation classes in school, but I probably should have.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question was also on the transportation sector. So the authors of the PAS report suggested increasing electrical vehicle use as a solution to decarbonize and decrease the amount of greenhouse gases produced across the transportation sector. The manufacturing process for creating electrical vehicles, however, relies on non-renewable resources like coal and critical minerals such as lithium and cobalt. In addition, both the extraction and manufacturing processes cause air and water pollution. So, how do you consider or balance the known environmental impacts of continuing to use gas-powered vehicles against the not yet fully understood effects of switching to electrical vehicles?
You're asking the questions that should be asked to people that make more than I do. Um, no, that's a great question. Let me think about that. Um, I don't even know where to start.
You can always follow up.
Yeah, I think like what I had answered to the previous question is probably about as good as I'm going to get on that. But again, those are the big questions that you should be asking. I know like everybody is like crazy about the EVs, and obviously, like if you're, like you said in your question, if your plant is still using non-renewable energy to make the EVs and to make the batteries, that doesn't, it like cancels out kind of the like net effect of it. Um, so yeah, let me think about that and I'll get back to you with an answer if that's okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
That is a good question. Thomas, I think you're up.
Right.
Hey.
My question was, in the PAS, you probably read that China and the United States are responsible for like almost half the world's total carbon emissions. And like it's usually like these developed countries that produce the most emissions, but the developing countries tend to have the most impact. So you think that the countries with the highest carbon emissions need to be held or like morally obligated, to, like contribute the most to like this fight against climate change? And if so, like how can we hold these countries accountable?
Again, another big question. I don't know the answer to that. So how can we hold the biggest polluting countries accountable for the emissions they're causing with like the undual effect to the other countries? Was that the question?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that either. I think, things that we can consider is just, I mean, the personal sustainability things that you can do like at the individual level are great. But you know, you can do everything to be like the most sustainable person, but it's not going to make that big of a difference if like your neighbor's not doing everything. So these really have to start at like the industry scale, and like at the community scale. So if we have like like rapid construction in like urban areas, I think things that we do at the local level, as far as like building regulations and ordinances and things like that, that's like a step in the right direction because that is facilitating what can be built, and therefore developed. And then like there's a couple of different levels to it. As far as like what we can do to hold these like large polluters accountable, I really don't know the answer to that. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah.
Yeah, Julia, this is, you're getting the full range of questions that this class is dealing with. Everything from the hyper specific to these really big questions. And so is this a
That's
fun course?
fantastic.
Hello, Julia. My name is Anthony. I'm a geography major.
Okay.
This one's more of a question about your background, so it should be a little less.
Should be able to answer that.
So most of us in here are environmental science and sustainability majors. So I was curious about your actual specific background that you had in environmental studies and sustainability, along with your master's degree in city, community, and regional planning, and how your actual education ties in with the work you're doing today in climate resiliency challenges in North Carolina. And on top of that, since I'm a geography major that's specific in GIS, are there any other tools that you use for your work? I know you said the stuff about the water level rising tool and the wildfire tool, but if there's any more, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I should be able to answer this question. So I went into undergrad with like environmental science as a general interest. I got told in my like first advising session that environmental science was going to require me to take like physics and chemistry and lots of calc, and I was like, just kidding. I think I want the BA. So my environmental studies and sustainability track, I think, really gave me a good like understanding of like baseline how everything works with like a focus on the people component of it, which is where I'm particularly interested. I love talking with like communities and helping them think about that. I'm not as much like a technical person, but I am more of like talking, like thinking about problems, like workshopping types of things. Um, so I think that kind of helped me get through school. I also did that field site, like study abroad opportunity, which was focused on coastal Eastern North Carolina. So I spent a semester at the Outer Banks with a field site there. And that kind of gave me this other perspective. I think also going through that hurricane gave me like an interest, like a continued interest in like what does that actually mean, because I could physically see like the changes that happened from it. My GIS minor in school was basically because I was just really interested in it at that field site. My like sophomore year, we did a project where we were looking at like land cover change, like suitability analyses and that kind of thing. And so I was just like interested in that as far as like the technical standpoint. And when I graduated, like I said, I was Googling for like environmental consulting, but I didn't know what that actually like looked like. And I was really struggling for a bit to just figure out what direction to go in as far as like a job that was specific to my major. The sustainability component was interesting to me, but I didn't really want to work in the emissions like mitigation sphere. So when I found the planning program, that was a little bit more the catch-all as far as like you have transportation, land use, economic development, housing, like that kind of thing. But I could actually see like planning jobs at the end of that tunnel. Not that I want to be like a town planner, that doesn't sound interesting at all, but working on topics that are like related to that is more or less like what I'm interested in. And then your other question was like for geography, for GIS tools. So in the work that I do, I work closely with a person that works on GIS, and he's doing like a lot of our mapping for the projects that we're working on. Those tools that I mentioned, were important to understand, but you could use those tools if you didn't have any GIS background. Some other things that we use specifically, a lot of the people at my company use CAD. I don't use CAD, but I'm more familiar with like ArcPro. We also use online story maps, which help communities to just like engage with the material. So I don't know that there's anything like super specific that you would need to like focus on, but it's good to have like a really good understanding of like how the GIS processes work, even if I was interested in GIS, but I didn't want it to be my full job. But I have an understanding of how it works so that I can help other people, like work on our projects. So
Sweet, thank you.
Awesome. All right. All right, Julie. So those are our official top 5. And thank you for taking time to answer the big and the small questions.
yeah.
Let's put Logan on the spot, see if he's actually still paying attention out there. So Logan, if you're there,
I am.
Logan, I know this is kind of in your wheelhouse, so I want to give you a chance to throw in a question if you want to do that.
Oh boy, you are putting me on the spot.
You don't have to.
No,
If
I
you
know.
want
I
to
mean, I'd
answer
like
the
to.
question, if you want to answer the question I had about those big questions that I didn't know, feel free.
Oh yeah, there you go. That's a far easier task.
That's okay.
Yeah, I
You
don't
have
know, man. I don't really have anything legit that
That's all right.
useful, unfortunately.
All right, does anyone else in here have a question they want to throw in? Okay, well, I think we're hitting almost time to class for end, so I'm getting that look.
Yes,
So why don't we, thank you, Julia, for coming to class. Thank you.
absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Class, thank you for participating. They really, they put a lot into this.
Yeah, that was awesome.
So, cool. And then I will, what we're gonna do is we're gonna use this YouTube. It was gonna go on YouTube, but it's not gonna be public. So we'll just kind of use it, chop it up and kind of review some pieces in class.
Okay.
And I'll follow up afterwards and we can reconnect that way.
Okay, sounds great.
All right, have a good day.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you for the Zoom link.
You're welcome. I'm glad you came.
Yep, me too.
All right. Bye.